Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Bennett, the Research Manager at the Royal Armouries, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the fifth talk in our winter lecture series. The Royal Armouries is the UK's national collection of arms and armour, with roots in the medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London. In the 19th century, our role as a historical collection overtook our role as a functional arsenal, though we were only formally established as a trustee museum in the 1980s. Our mission as a museum is to promote the public's understanding and enjoyment of arms and armour, and our annual winter lecture series is one of the means by which we do this. These events run until April and cover topics ranging from the conservation of Japanese armour to Tudor tournaments. These events will appear on our webpage, royalarmouries.org. However, to keep up to date as they're advertised, consider following us on Eventbrite or subscribing to us on the social media network of your choice. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to us on YouTube to give you easy access to both the live events and the subsequent recordings, which will be available generally until the Monday after the talk. Now, as always, there'll be a question and answer session after the talk. If you're watching on YouTube, please type your question in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're watching via Zoom, you'll find a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you'll be able to type questions. As always, while I can't guarantee to get through them all, I will cover as many as I can. Today's event runs a little longer than usual, so if you think you probably have to leave us dead on 3, feel free to submit your questions early and watch the Q&A session on YouTube at your convenience. So with the necessary preparation out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Cyril Dixon. In his time, Cyril has been a regimental signaller, a structural engineer, and a general manager and director of a company. However, it's his interest in the special operations executive as an independent historian and family researcher that brings him to us today. So without any further ado, let me hand you over to our speaker, Cyril Dixon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I first give my thanks to Royal Armouries Leeds for this opportunity to bring this remarkable story about a young lady in the SOE in World War II. And thank you all for joining us. I'd just like to clear up one little bit of housekeeping on the publicity that was put on the website prior to this talk. I did say that 2 people were rescued or saved. There was a 3rd SOE agent, and Eileen Nairn, who actually had been moved from Ravensbruck to another camp nearer to the Swiss border a few weeks earlier. She escaped from a forced march and in fact was repatriated to the UK by the American Army. So that should have read 2 returned from Ravensbruck. All will be revealed as we go along. And if I can just move, Mark, can I get view off here? I've got your, I want to get to the screen. I've got you, but not mine.
You say, so if you find the white camera icon down at the bottom.
We've got the Q&A participants. Oh, right, on the back, to the left, yep. Oh, that's the video. I don't seem to have that. I've got your name and my picture.
Yeah, so down the bottom, there'll be, next to Q&A, there'll be share screen.
Share screen, yep.
Mm-hmm.
Click that.
Yep, and then if you should have it, you'd see your PowerPoint window should appear there, and if you click it, it'll share it.
Yep. Okay.
There we go.
There we go. We're in business.
Perfect.
Okay, well, nothing to do. Let's get on with it. Women in war. World War II coming to an end, but still a lot of work to do. And at the moment, Mark, my up and down is not working.
So down on your bottom taskbar, if you click the PowerPoint icon, that should take you back to the PowerPoint. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Don't know how I did that, but I did it. Right, women in war. The young lady we're talking about today is Yvonne Baisden. Code name given, Odette. Now, this shouldn't be confused with other Odettes that were agents. There was an Odette Churchill, Odette Sanson, and one or two others. She was also known as Y.J. Bernier, also Toga, and I'm quite sure there was a few more put in which hasn't come to the surface yet. This is where it all starts in World War I, the Chteau de Chavenai. And my apologies if my French pronunciation is not what it should be, but at the school I went to, French wasn't taught. This chateau was built starting in 1620, just 400 years ago, and was the home of Count and Countess de Vibray. Also living there was an Antoinette de Vibray. All looked nice and peaceful, a nice afternoon in coming towards the end of the summer in 1918. But high above there was a young RAF, well, no, sorry, he was a flying corps pilot fighting with the aircraft. He got mechanical problems and it was inevitable he was going to crash land. He looked for a spot to crash land and he came down near to the chateau which you've just seen the picture of. He was slightly injured, took to the hospital, had his wounds dressed, and Count de Vibray sent his daughter, Antoinette, to go to the hospital to bring him back for tea. This she did. Lo and behold, they then asked him to stay for dinner, which he did. And cutting a long story short, in 1920, after the end of the war, the young pilot was Clifford Baisden, and he married Antoinette. They had two children, Yvonne being born 20th of January 1922. She also had a brother, the name of Rex. He was born 2 years later. And just to set the background to the SOE, and people are already familiar with it, if they could just bear with me for a short time. The SOE was formed in 1940 by what is now Sir Winston Churchill. He was the newly appointed Prime Minister of the time. He gave instructions that the SOE, as it was going to be called, the Special Operations Executive, should set Europe alight. At first, there was resistance from the RAF and the Royal Navy, as they were concerned that they could be losing aircraft, ships, boats, and their crews, all to deliver 1 or 2 agents to mainland Europe. After the first early successes, the effectiveness could be seen and recruitment was begun. At the same time, Charles de Gaulle, he was giving his speech calling for the French to give resistance to the invaders and to fight on as long as they could. This Yvonne, who was dual national, French and English, because that's where she was registered, and although she lived in England for some of the time, she saw the opportunity of doing her bit, as she referred to it. She applied to join the French resistance, which was known as the FR section, F for French and R for resistance. Unfortunately, Charles de Gaulle thought this was not the right thing to do, and he refused her application, simply because she had got an English father. From that, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, as we know it as the WAF. She worked at the Ministry of Defence in London. She was a secretary, interpreter, because she was dual speaking French and English. She'd taken typing courses and things of that nature. And she worked there for a period of time. Unfortunately, she spotted a personal file, and written on that was that she should be restricted access to the operations area because she got a French mother. So craziness. French wouldn't have her because she got an English father, and the English didn't want her because she got a French mother. So after some discussion with what turned out to be another SOE agent, Pearl Witherington, she volunteered for the SOE. This after going through the usual interviews where everything was laid on the table, quite frankly. She was transferred to the First Aid and Nursing Yeomanry, popularly known as the Fanny. The training was usually at country estates, large country estates, for the seclusion, and of course they were in remote areas where they could be put through the paces and really had to suffer during the training stage. These were mainly through the areas in England and Scotland. They were trained in sabotage techniques, weapon training, which would be put into use if necessary when they were on foreign land, and parachuting, which was done at the time at Ringway Airport, Manchester, which we all know now as Manchester Airport. She was once asked if she could shoot a man, and the answer was yes. Could she stab a man? And thought, well, she had been trained to do it, but she didn't answer yes or no. She got through the art of self-defense, and as I've said, trained to kill. She specialized in as a radio operator. This, unfortunately, had a very short operational time. She was informed at the interviews that a radio operator was unlikely to exceed 6 weeks on operations before having to be withdrawn or unfortunately killed or captured. This was because the German locators could range in a very short space of time, 20 to 30 minutes, on a radio operator sending a message. They could receive as much as they liked, but not send. She had to be trained in coding, decoding, and of course the Morse code. But previous jobs of typing, shorthand, and office duties made this probably a little bit easier for her. They naturally had to use explosives, and that could obviously be exciting if things didn't go exactly to plan. She was then allocated to F section, which, as I said at the start, F was for French, the French section, which was organised by the British SOE. She was paired with a Gonzalez de Saint-Genet, the code name was Lucien, for the operation, and they were to be parachuted into France, reorganised as Scholar Resistance Group. The Scholar Resistance Group had previously been disbanded by the Gestapo. They had to regroup and get it as an active resistance movement. They were, in fact, preparing for D-Day, because everyone knew D-Day was coming, but didn't know when. And they would be flying out of RAF Tempsford. RAF Tempsford is in Bedfordshire, just to the east of Bedford, by the A1. This looks a little simple, innocuous barn. It was. But this was where the agents were kitted out. This has recently been restored in years. It was almost a wreck, but it's now, I haven't seen it since it's been finished, but this is a recent photograph. It was named as Gibraltar Barn. They would be taken there, the agents would be taken there in the dark. It would be dark down country lanes. There was no light at the time because of the blackouts. The only light on cars and other vehicles was a small slit in each headlamp, and that small slit would be no more than 1 centimetre by about 5 centimetres. All signage was taken down. Metal signs were melted down for tanks to make tanks and guns. So the agents wouldn't know where they were flying from. In all, there was 40 female agents were sent into France. Now there's queries on numbers. This is because with the women, obviously, they got a choice. They could use their maiden names, their single name, their married names, even the Christian names, and it all adds to the confusion of determining how many were actually sent in there. But it would be 40 would be a reasonable figure to work on. They were sent out, 40 in total. 23 were withdrawn after a short period of time. 13 were captured and executed. 2 died of natural causes in the field, and 2, which were at Ravensbruck, were captured but evaded execution. The 3rd one, as I mentioned at the start, was sent to another prison camp where she escaped and was repatriated. As I said earlier, the odds were not good. Did she survive? She was given a new identity. I suppose that would be Mademoiselle Bernier. She teamed up with Lucien, as I said, and they had their Christmas in 1943 at Bewley in Hampshire, which was basically the finishing school for the agents. And a little word on Lucien. He was French. He'd been captured by the Germans in 1940. He deliberately broke his own arm with an axe to enable him to be sent to hospital from where he escaped. He came back, he came to England in 1943 and volunteered to go back to France. He and Yvonne worked very well together, and we will cover more of their exploits a little further on. As I said, they were to rebuild the circuit or the resistance movement. They flew out of Tempsford at a second attempt, as the first one was aborted because when they got to the drop zone, signals which they should have received from the ground didn't happen. So they thought something had gone wrong, so the plane came back. However, on the 18th of March 1944, they flew out of Tempsford in a Halifax bomber, captained by Flight Lieutenant Downey. They departed at 20:25 hours and landed back at Tempsford at 03:22 hours. The official note of that flight indicated there was no casualties in the crew. They would have parachuted out of the Halifax through what was called the Joey hole, Joey being Joey, and this was basically a hole in the base of the fuselage, of which the agents would shuffle along, fully kitted out, and drop through the Joey hole, and obviously parachute down. If by any chance they didn't do as they were told and keep the body straight when they was leaving the aircraft, they were likely to hit the head and face on the opposite side of the hole. This crudely was called ringing the bell. That's military humor for you. On the 18th of March, when they parachuted out, Yvonne was the youngest female agent at 22 years and 2 months old to be parachuted into occupied territory. When they landed, a message would be sent back to England to say that they had arrived safely And they used messages, pre-arranged messages, such as roulette is a dangerous game, or beware of the big bad wolf, something like that. They landed north of the Pyrenees, and this left them 2 days of travelling to get across to the Dole region in the east of France. This they did and set to work. First priority was to rebuild the Scholar resistance group, and then got into various operational operations to harass and upset the German communications. Yvonne was credited with being involved with Operation Cadillac, which was the largest airdrop of equipment to the resistance that there's ever been, certainly in the Second World War and since then. There's a little confusion with dates, in so much that there was originally intended that they would be flying from 9 airfields in the UK. There would be 9 drop zones carrying a total of 427 tons of arms and ammunition. For operational reasons, and mainly because the German Luftwaffe was active in 2 of the areas, it was in fact changed to 7 drop zones. I understand that Operation Cadillac was organized and coordinated by a group called SOE/SO, which assisted in the planning of the drops and the sites. Yvonne had been credited with being involved with this, and it was to take place between the 14th and 18th of July, i.e. after D-Day. However, on the 25th of June, 3 weeks before the first date of Cadillac, there was also an airdrop. Now, whether that was part of Cadillac or not, I'm not sure. But that was a successful airdrop, and it was a good one. And they decided that the next day it would be nice if they could have a dinner to celebrate. But before we go on to that, we'll just cover what was actually going to be in Operation Cadillac. Drops were going to be made by the 492nd American 8th Group Bomb Group. Oh, what a mouthful. It would be daylight drops, which the Americans always did. It would involve 320 aircraft, 9 drop zones, which was later changed to 7, 427 tons, 3,791 containers, and only 29 missed the target. That is remarkable. 2 aircraft didn't get back. They landed in Normandy as they were attacked by German fighters on the way back. But fortunately, only 1 aircraftsman was wounded. Again, very successful flights. Arms and ammunition dropped. There's a list. I won't go through them all individually, but you can see explosives, Sten guns, 9mm rounds for Sten guns, over 5 million of them, grenades. That's French style and the British style. What's that? 6,500. Pistols, Bren guns, and nearly 7 million rounds of 303 ammunition. Rifles and infantry, anti-tank guns, and bombs to suit, as we would call them, shells, but the Americans decided bombs sounded better, I think. They decided they were going to have this lunch the following day, which they set about doing. It was going to be at, some call it a cheese farm, some call it a cheese factory out in the countryside. I personally think it was a farm that made their own cheese, so they called it a cheese factory. About 8 or 9 of the resistance workers, including Yvonne and Lucian, gathered, and all was going well until a young lad, 16-year-old, was cycling to join them at the dinner, and what happened? He got captured by the Germans. He was beaten up, and some say that his left eye was badly damaged. Some say it was torn from its socket. However, he was beaten so much that he led the Germans to the farm. Fortunately, the lookouts saw them coming, and they all dashed to their prearranged hidey holes, and Germans came in, looked around, couldn't see nothing too suspicious. The farmer's wife had cleared all the table and food off, and they had to look around and then left, leaving 2 Germans outside on guard, as they were still a little bit suspicious. As the day wore on, the 2 guards got even more suspicious, of the number of bicycles left outside and the number of times that the toilet was being flushed. On thinking about this, they decided they called the German the Gestapo back, as they could look more closely. On going into the farmhouse, one German sprayed the ceiling with machine gun fire. Some reports say it was accidental. I think it was deliberate. And unfortunately, Lucian, who was hiding in the loft, was shot in the head and killed instantly. Some reports say he committed suicide. I am convinced that he was shot because blood fell through the hole that the bullet had gone through. The Germans saw the blood and obviously tore the place apart, capturing most of the resistance workers that were still there. This led to Yvonne being captured. She was dragged from behind a partition by the hair, beaten, manacled, and taken to Dole prison. She was there put into solitary confinement for 3 days and nights. No food, no water, no bed, just a board to lie on and a heavily blood-stained blanket. She was interrogated and used a cover story as she was just an ordinary French woman that had got caught up with the resistance movement. she did not budge from that. From there, she was moved to Dijon prison. There, things got tough. She was regularly beaten, tortured, because of not knowing who was watching this Zoom cast. I won't say too much about the torture, but she, in fact, had her feet stamped on, bare feet stamped on the toes and on the ankles by a jackbooted interrogator. This left her, she could barely walk. In fact, she had to be dragged to and from her cell when she was going to be interrogated. At times, they would come, ask her the same questions. They wanted to know mainly which airfield she flew out of in England. She couldn't tell them, could she? She didn't know where it was anyhow. And then, after a few days, an interrogator came in and told her day by day what she'd actually done from the day she arrived in France. Obviously, one of the resistance workers had been broken, and that's not unexpected, and had told them exactly what had happened. Again, the only thing he didn't know, and no one knew, was which airfield she took from. She still didn't change her cover story. She was French, young girl caught up with the resistance. She was kept there for 2 or 3 weeks and then moved on to Zarbruck concentration camp. Here, she met up with people that anyone that's read any stories on the SOE would be familiar with the names of Violette Szabo, Denise Bloch, Lillian Rolfe, and Cecile Lebeau. They have been in training with Yvonne in England. They also have been captured and were in transit, like Yvonne, to Ravensbruck concentration camp. Life for them was a little easier at Zarbruck. Food was marginally better. Then eventually they were moved to the railway station for a 4-day journey by rail to Ravensbruck concentration camp. There was about 60 women to each cattle truck. There were no facilities in the trucks. They were not allowed out of the trucks, and they were only served 1 or 2 meals of sausage and bread in the whole journey. After 4 days, they eventually got to Ravensbruck. This was a camp about 50 miles north of Berlin. It was built originally to house approximately 6,000 women SSS officers as a training camp. During the later periods of the war, there was between 130 and 132,000 prisoners passed through the camp, of which about 90,000 died. They arrived in the late autumn of 1944, and over the winter of 1944-45, temperatures was going down as low as -27 degrees Celsius. Not very warm when you're only scantily clad, no facilities, very little heating in the huts, and life was tough. In each of the huts, there would be a small bay which would have been originally built for 1 or 2 trainee SS officers. With the prisoners, there were 3-tier bunks, each bunk housing at least 2 to each bunk. They would have 1 blanket between them, no heating or very little. Typhus, dysentery, sickness was rife. And during this time, Yvonne had teamed up, as she found her on the train going to Ravensbruck, with another agent, Mary Lindell. We'll be coming on to Mary Lindell a little later when you'll see what she was doing. And just as a point of interest, when the Russians liberated the camp on the 30th of April 1945, there were still 45,000 prisoners there. A typical day would be Reveille at around 4:30. Appel or parade would be 7:30 till about 9 o'clock. Work was allocated and they were set to do the work and would return in the early evening, usually around the 5 o'clock. That covers the figures we've just said. Executions were frequent. Hanging, injections. That may sound probably the cleanest way, but unfortunately they used a very cheap disinfectant, which was called phenol or phenol, which gave them a slower death than some of the modern injections you get today. Shootings, that was regular and usually done by a single shot in the back of the neck. The injection was usually given by doctors under the pretense that they were injecting them or vaccinating them against typhus, which was rife in the camp. All of these took place next to crematoriums, where it was convenient for the bodies to be took directly into the crematorium and obviously destroyed. It should be noted that Yvonne was probably one of the last British people to see Violette Szabo, Denise Block, and Lillian Rolfe alive, as they were murdered in a yard outside the crematorium and were killed by a single shot in the back of the neck. Some say they were hung, some say this, some say that, but they were killed by Corporal Schultz of the German army. He was the executioner. Cecile Lefort, she was taken in the hospital, disappeared, and was never seen again. This was common when it came to the hospital. The concentrate executions of F section agents was Natzweiler, 4 of them, Dachau, 4 of them, Belsen, 1, and Ravensbruck, 4, who I've just mentioned. There was also experiments carried out. The prisoners was used, as they called them, rabbits. The prisoners usually volunteered because they thought it might do them favours, they may get better food and looked after better. And the Germans were studying the effects of gangrene. They would even do this by inducing gangrene into purpose-made cuts to the body to see what effect it had. Muscle damage, that was also experimented on, and in fact, bone transplants. It didn't do the rabbits any good because when they finished the experiment, they would be murdered. I mentioned Mary Lindell earlier on. She was a middle-aged heiress. In World War I, she worked as a nurse in a French hospital. World War II, she was in MI19, a British escape organisation, and established the Marie Claire escape line that helped many Allied airmen to return to Britain. She had one son murdered by the Gestapo, the second son imprisoned, sentenced to death, but saved and released after Mary bribed an Italian senior official. She worked in the hospital at Ravensbruck, which now brings us on to this slide here, because at the end of 1944, Yvonne was taken ill with tuberculosis, commonly called TB, which at that time was a killer. There was no antibiotics. They said fresh air was the best cure for it, but in temperatures that could go down to minus 27 Celsius, fresh air is a bit difficult. She gradually lost weight, sank further into weakness because of the illness. She could barely breathe. And Mary Lindell, with her nursing experience, decided that she would be better in the hospital. Now that may sound good, but unfortunately in the hospital, daily the doctors would visit the wards, they would check the patients, and any that they thought would not make a good recovery, make them fit enough to work again, they were sent off to the gas chambers or Belsen. Mary, one way or another, by fiddling temperature results, got Yvonne moved into the hospital where she could try and look after her better. It was a dangerous move. Would it pay off? Sadly and alarmingly, on one particular day, Mary looked down the list of people going to Belsen, and lo and behold, Yvonne's name was on that list. This was almost a death sentence. However, somehow or other, Mary manipulated the list and Yvonne's name was taken from it. Still left her very ill, but the war was coming, although they didn't know it. They knew it was getting closer and would soon be over. They were into April. And at this time, there was negotiation going on Oops, sorry, pressing the wrong way. There was negotiations on between the Swedish Red Cross and Heinrich Himmler, a name we're all too aware of, to allow certain prisoners to be taken from the concentration camps and taken to Sweden. Mary got her name and Yvonne's on the list to go with the first dispatches of patients to Sweden. The negotiations were probably in favour of the Swedish Red Cross because a lot of the German officers were looking to seek favour from the Allies as they could see the war rapidly coming to an end. The Swedish Red Cross used what was called the White Bus operation, which was buses, as it indicates, painted white with Red Crosses on. It did, in fact, over a period of time, take 17,000 prisoners, mainly Jews, transporting them from the camps to Malmö in Sweden. This in itself could be a dangerous trip. On the 28th of April, 1945, 3 buses arrived at the camp. Yvonne and Mary and the others loaded on and left 2 days before the Russians liberated Ravensbruck. There was only 2 survivors, Odette Sanson and Yvonne Bayston. As I said earlier, Eileen Nern had been moved away. After a hazard trip through northern Germany, Denmark, they would cross across to Sweden by ferry to Malmö. She was then moved to Gothenburg, where I'm assuming it would be by sea. She was taken across to Scotland, and she then took a train down to London. Arriving in London, penniless, hoping she could get through to the MOD. She could remember the telephone number of Nancy Wake, another SOE agent. So she phoned Nancy. Nancy quickly took down the details, got the MOD involved, and they soon recovered Yvonne from her plight. So she'd saved it. She got back. However, she'd still got recovery and surgery to get over. She spent around 9 months rebuilding her body to make it strong enough to withstand the forthcoming surgery. This was carried out at, and I've seen several places mentioned, but I understand it was at the Royal Midhurst Hospital in the south of England. After 9 months, they operated on her, one of the surgeons being a gentleman with the name of Price Thomas. And for those that don't know who Price Thomas was, he was, in fact, one of the surgeons who operated on King George VI when he was ill. She rejoined the WAF as if she hadn't had enough. After recovering, they'd removed an abscess from her lungs. She then worked as an aerial photography interpreter and was in fact demobbed in 1947. The awards, you can see there, France, Legion d'Honneur, Croix de Guerre and Palm. Oh, the next one's quite a mouthful, but basically Combatant Volunteer Resistance. From the British, he had the MBE, War Medal, Defence Medal, French and Germany Star, and the Battle of Britain Star. At Tempsford, you've got there a memorial mosaic. Yvonne's name is the fifth one on the left-hand side of that picture. And it's a nice little quiet spot to visit by the old church in Tempsford. In civilian life, for those of us that remember the Red Book by Eamon Andrews, This Is Your Life, and Series 1, Episode 2, I believe it was, yes, Episode 4, Program 2, was about Yvonne Baston. If anyone can find a copy of that, I would be very appreciative. It was filmed without recordings on the 25th of September 1955. There's also French Resistance YouTube film, only about 4 or 5 minutes, made by members of the original resistance that she worked with. It's in French, but it is self-explanatory. She got married to Desmond Bailey, and they worked in Central Africa, now Zambia, and she then remarried, and when her second husband retired, they moved to Portugal, and when her second husband passed away in 1999, she came back to London, and sadly she passed away in 2017. Just like to say thanks to Todd and Margaret Baston, Margaret being my cousin, Todd being Margaret's husband and Yvonne's cousin. The Violet Zorbo Museum, which is just south of Hereford. It's small, it's been extended this year, should have been finished, but of course the virus has stopped that. It will be reopened next year, full of artifacts and items on the SOE. And also Harrington Aviation Museum, which is just off the A14 north of Northampton, where the American Air Force was based, and that again is full of very interesting items. National Archives, who provided me with some information, including a 3-page affidavit for the War Crimes Tribunal. Imperial War Museum, who set me in the right direction with articles to look up and read. And of course, some of the obituaries that was done at the time when she passed away. And above all, here, the Royal Armouries in Leeds, who have been very helpful, kept me on the straight and narrow, took me through this minefield of technical jargon, and my appreciation and thanks to both of the people involved, Mark and Robbie. Thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you, Cyril. I mean, yeah, and presumably thanks to Jonathan and I guess Mark as well, who have been steering you through the technical jargon on our part. No, it's very grateful to you for delivering the talk, because it's a fascinating story, albeit an incredibly harrowing one as well. As Kate Pink mentioned, phenomenal courage, and obviously symbolic of a lot of covert ops work during the war. For the questioning, I might start with perhaps a happier topic. So this meeting between Clifford and Antoinette, are they from dramatically different social strata, or is this a case of English aristocracy and French aristocracy seeing kindred spirits in one another?
Well, from Antoinette, obviously Yvonne's mother, they were from the aristocracy in France. From Clifford's point of view, I would say they were a normal family, but they were very well educated. They had the amount of service they did in both World Wars is fantastic. And I've spent a lot of time on that with Margaret. And I would say he was from, I'll call it, being polite, a normal background, and she was from the aristocracy.
Yeah, because you hear Royal Flying Corps and you think British officer in the First World War, and you think, oh, must be lofty, gentry type stuff. But actually, there's a lot of middle class people who gain opportunities as a result of that. Oh
yes, well, in the First World War of the Basin family, Todd's father, he was also in the Flying Corps, it was the Navy flying first. He was actually aboard the HMS Furious when the first aircraft carrier landing was made. And he joined the Army Flying Corps later. Then you've got Clifford, they were cousins. They were in. We've also got a cousin in, he's passed away now, joined the Canadian Flying Corps. And this is what I call a pretty good English family. And there's lots more coming out of the woodwork. I mean, one of Margaret's uncles, he was an MC with bar, which, as we all know, is quite a feat. Mentioned in dispatches. I was going to say military cross is one below the Victoria Cross, I think. It's the one below, yeah. And he won it twice. And the bar being the second one. So it's equivalent to two just below the Victoria Cross. And things like that. And he served in the Second World War with the Canadian Army. He was CEO of No. 3 Provost Company, who he joined the Canadian Army within 6 weeks. He was in England. So it's quite a family. And my side, the Dixons, I thought we'd had an exciting time, but the Bastons were, fantastic. Yeah. Our family lost a great uncle, two uncles. My grandfather was wounded. He had to come out early in the First World War. My father had to come out because he was the only male left in the family because his brother had been killed at Ypres. No, I thought that was all good because all this has come out in the last few years. Yeah. And I thought, I didn't do too bad myself. And then when I think and look and see what others have done, mine's nothing, absolutely nothing. Yeah. But I mean, they're obviously, as I said, they're obviously an adventurous family, but was there qualms at the time about training women to do this sort of operation? Because I can't recall anything similar in World War I, though obviously the circumstances are very different. No, I think World War I, you got doctors and nurses were female, but of course they were usually away from the front line. As far as I'm aware, World War II was the first, it was when SOE was formed. And they would be the first in what I'll call front line, although they wasn't in full army gear and all the rest of it. They were up there, they was mixing it with the enemy, let's put it that way. and many, I'm sure, had to kill, and many were killed themselves. So it was a tough time, and there's a limited number. You're only looking at around about 40, and they did a good job, and I don't think they're recognised enough. It only comes out almost by accident that the SOE was operational and they had women in there. And I think they did a good job in many, many ways. And I think this story of Yvonne is just one of them. And she didn't seek the limelight when she came out. She just wanted a nice, quiet marriage life, and that was it.
To be fair, I don't blame her for having had enough at that stage. We had an interesting question from Mark Johnson, which is, why are the Germans so keen to find out where they've flown from? And equally, why are the British so keen to keep it a secret? Because as I understood it, the German spy networks in the UK were dismantled fairly early on. And although you can bomb an airfield, they will just move elsewhere. So why are they so eager to discover this?
Well, I think first and foremost was why did they want to find them? Is if their spies hadn't found them, they wanted to know where they were, and obviously they could then watch the airfield, see when planes were taking off, what missions they were on, and be prepared in the occupied areas to meet them when they parachuted in. I think that was one of the main reasons. And of course, Haddington, which was the United States Air Force base, was only about 30 miles away, which would be a key target. And all they wanted to do, I think, was find out more and more about it to see what damage they could do, to our spy network going over there, or agents going over there, seeing what they could do to disrupt the flow of people and arms and ammunition over to the resistance. Let's face it, Operation Cadillac was put in to stop, or delay, I should say, they knew they couldn't stop it, the crack panzer division that would be coming up from the south of France to Normandy after D-Day, obviously to make it more difficult for the Allies. And it said that they delayed them by what would have been a 2-day journey, was at least a couple of weeks. And in that time, it gave the Allies time to get the bridgehead fixed and settled and stocked, and make advances into Normandy, and probably saved many, many hundreds, if not thousands of lives. So that was the prime objective there. So it's, yeah.
I was going to say, presumably that's the reason that the Piat was included in the weapons that was being distributed at that stage. But
yes, yeah.
Hard to envisage taking on a tank with a Piat, even if you're a trained soldier, but handing it out to the resistance almost seems a little bit cruel.
Well, I don't think I actually mentioned it in the talk, but part of the training of the agents was to train the resistance with the use of the various arms, including Bren, Stens, rifles, pistols, knives, and Piats. I mean, let's face it, you've got to get very close to a Panzer if you're going to knock it out with a Piat. I was all right, we got 25 pounders, which is a good start, but that was part of the agent's brief, was to train the resistance. And it would be a harrowing experience, I would think, to take a Panzer on with a Fiat, but they did many strange things.
And rather than being, so the SOE, just for sort of clarity, are not spies as such. They're there training the resistance. They're not embedded in French society. They've got a cover story, but it's a cover story to fall back on rather than a permanent identity.
That's right. They basically they're the brief for Lucien and Yvonne was to reorganize the scholar group because that had been decimated by the Gestapo. Get that as a fighting unit, retrain them, cause as much havoc as possible, and melt into the background. Some call them spies, some call them agents. And if you look up each of them, one refers to the other. If you look up agent, it'll refer to a spy. And if you look up spy, it refers to an agent. I prefer the name agent because I think it just sounds a little bit nicer. But they had to live a very covert life. And one of the difficulties with doing investigations like this is to get at the information, because it's all been secret up until the last few years. So you're dealing with someone that's been kept secret to find out which way you should be going and what you can use. And for instance, her affidavit was only released, I think, in 2017. So it's all new. And what I've tried to do, and with the help of Harrington Museum, the National Archives, is to use official documents wherever I could. And I've got reports on the Operation Cadillac, the drop zones, what was dropped at each of the sites. I've got the independent views done by the MOD who went with some of the flights. So I've tried to use that wherever possible, because some of the things you see written, there's always little things which you say, well, that can't be right, or it isn't right. And if you use the official documents, you've got a good start. But
I was going to say, we've had a recommendation in the chat as well from Judy Kunkler, who says the first aid nursing yeomanry have archives themselves that may be of interest. So I don't know how far you are through the research project, but if you don't mind having another source added to it, that may be a good avenue.
I'll keep looking.
Yeah, and then thank you to Judy
tell
for
me very
recommending.
often I'm very tenacious. But now I look, if I think there's a lead, then I go there. I mean, when I first started on this, I was pointed across to, well, Bletchley Park originally. They very kindly talked to me about Tempsford and Harrington Aviation Museum, who I've been to quite a few times. And there would have been more, but for the virus this year. And I find people very helpful. And if they give me a lead, then I like to follow it up. And there's places I wanted to do this year, but it just hasn't been possible for obvious reasons.
Well, you know, hopefully things will look up. But there's so many fascinating stories like this to be told, and you know, people are eager to give you access to them. One question that sort of came up for me was this: the 16-year-old who was picked up by the Germans and gave the location of the cheese farm, cheese factory away. Was he known to the authorities? Was he behaving suspiciously, or was it just a case of bad luck that he got picked up?
He was cycling to the dinner and come to a checkpoint, and they stopped and searched, and of course they found the radio. Well, that was immediately the warning sign there was something going on. And from what I can gather, they beat him something terrible. And in fact, he was then sent off to a concentration camp and never came out.
Yeah.
That's sad. He was only 16 when they caught him.
Mm.
Bad luck.
Yeah, but doing something for his country at least. So.
Oh yes, yes, yes. I mean, there's some things I've had to cut back at the time. There's things like when Yvonne was probably at the lowest, where she got no strength left. She suffering from the tuberculosis, and one particular night she said to Mary Lindell, who they shared a bunk anyhow, that if she didn't last and didn't get out, at least she could basically die knowing she'd done her bit. And that was the attitude, I think, of, well, many people right the way through the whole of the fighting force, not just the SOE.
Yeah.
And there's in the interest sayings in some of the books that you see, where one I read where Yvonne had said, well, I was the sort of person that the tram always hit the person on the other side of the track. In other words, I'm immortal. It didn't hit me. Things like that come out, which, it's difficult to fit everything in on these talks, but you can only give the, well, outline with some detail, obviously, but they're the little things that make it a human story, as well as war, tragedy, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
And in the interest of tying up one of the loose ends, we had a question from Paul as to, is there any record of what happened to Mary, the nurse who kept her off the list for going to Belsen?
Oh, Mary Lindell. Well, they remained in touch for many years. And she was English, but what happened into her career afterwards, I haven't looked into that.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that Mary's influence and guile and cunning, I think, added to that, certainly saved Yvonne's life. And if it wasn't for her, she would have not survived.
Yeah, and it's a somewhat happier note to end on as well, in a story which could have gone a very different way and did for a lot of other people in a similar position. But it's good news. Exactly, it's at least some consolation. So thank you very much for delivering today's lecture, Cyril. Just for those who weren't aware, this was scheduled to happen on, I think, the week after lockdown struck.
It was, so exactly, yes.
We've rescheduled slightly, but we have actually managed to have it take place.
We've got there in the end, as I say. No, it was, we missed it by a week, unfortunately, but this has worked well because it's given me an opportunity to get involved with Zoom and other similar bits of kit, and it's been different.
I'm going to say the world's your oyster now. You can take this international.
I think the last talk I gave was in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, at their university. They had about 350, 400 students there. And I was having to talk about something which I'd only seen the day before. But that was live, so
I was going to say,
there was no recording of that, I don't think.
To all our international viewers, and if you're watching this again in Brazil, then thank you for joining us. And thank you to Cyril for giving the talk today. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. But I'd also like to thank Robbie for producing the event behind the scenes, and to the audience for taking time out of your day to attend, and for the questions that you had for the speaker. If you have questions pertaining to our collection, to the SOE belt pistol that you saw in the introductory slide or anything like that, Inquiries at armories.org.uk will get you in touch with one of our curators. Our next event on the 9th of December takes us back to the elections of the 19th century. Dr. Patrick Kuhn, Principal Investigator on the Causes and Consequences of Election Violence project, currently running at Durham University, will explore the realities of individual and mass violence in what we often assume to be a more genteel era. For details, please go to our website, which is royalarmories.org. I look forward to seeing you there in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and have a good afternoon.